English novelist Marie Corelli, author of the popular 1886 novel A Romance of Two Worlds, once wrote, "Let me be mad, mad with the madness of absinthe, the wildest, most luxurious madness in the world." In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, few vices exemplified the spirit of La Belle Epoque and the ideals of the Bohemian Revolution like the drinking of absinthe. The potent dark green spirit was embraced by a whole generation of romantic painters, novelists, poets, and philosophers, from Edgar Degas and Vincent van Gogh to Oscar Wilde and Ernest Hemingway, featuring prominently in dozens of classic paintings and works of literature. Touted as an artistic muse in a bottle, absinthe was said to produce a pleasant, lucid intoxication and vivid hallucinations, earning it the nickname of the Green Fairy. But while the artistic community sang the praises of absinthe, more conservative factions of society condemned the drink, blaming its consumption for all manner of social ills, including idleness, poverty, epilepsy, madness, and even murder. The growing hysteria ultimately led to absinthe being banned across most of Europe, a ban that would remain in place for nearly a century. But was the Green Fairy really the powerful, mind-altering drug of Bohemian legend, and did it really lead its users, as one critic put it, straight to the madhouse or the courthouse? Fill up your glasses as we dive into the mysterious and romantic history of absinthe. Absinthe gets its name from Artemisia absinthium, or grand wormwood, a small herbaceous plant native to Eurasia and parts of North Africa. First mentioned in the Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical treatise from 1550 BC, wormwood has been used throughout history for medicinal purposes such as treating malaria and expelling parasitic worms from the body. However, the first use of the herb in alcoholic beverages dates to the late 18th century. According to one account, absinthe originated in 1792 as a patent medicine or tonic created by Dr. Pierre Ordinaire, a French physician living in the town of Cuvée in Switzerland. Ordinaire's recipe was purchased by the Henriot sisters, who produced the elixir commercially before selling it in 1797 to one Major Duby. In 1805, along with his son Marcelle and his son-in-law Henri-Louis Pernod, Dubé opens the world's first absinthe distillery in Pontarlier, France. This was under the company name Maison Pernod Fils. Pernod Fils would go on to become one of the most popular manufacturers of absinthe and survives to this day under the name Pernod Ricard. Traditional absinthe is flavored with a variety of herbs, the principal or holy trinity of flavorings being wormwood, green anise, and sweet fennel. Additional flavorings vary from manufacturer to manufacturer and can include hyssop, melissa, star anise, angelica, peppermint, coriander, and veronica. The dominant flavor, however, typically comes from the anise, giving absinthe a pronounced licorice taste, similar to related spirits like Greek ouzo, Italian sambuca, and French pastis. Red or pink absinthes flavored and colored with rose or hibiscus flowers have also been recorded. Absinthe manufacture begins with a neutral spirit derived from distilling wine, in which the chosen botanicals are steeped to extract their flavor. The resulting macerated spirit is then run through a still, producing a colorless spirit known as white absinthe or Le Bleu. It is sometimes bottled straight, but more often the distillate is steeped again in botanicals to produce absinthe's traditional green color. While distillation is the preferred manufacturing method, cheaper absinthes are sometimes produced via cold mixing, in which the botanicals are simply steeped in plain commercial alcohol and the resulting infusion filtered and bottled with no intermediate distillation. Whatever the method, absinthe is typically bottled at extremely high proof, ranging from 45% alcohol by volume to as high as 90%. Though often described as a liqueur, traditional absinthe is bottled without added sugar and is thus more properly classified as a spirit. Absinthe's popularity took off in the 1840s when French troops serving in Algeria began drinking the spirit in order to stave off malaria. By the 1860s, absinthe had become so popular in French cafes, bistros, and cabarets that the hour of 5 to 6 p.m. became widely known as le heure vert, or the green hour. In the 1880s, mass production caused the price of absinthe to plummet, and by 1910, the French were drinking some 36 million litres of absinthe every year compared to their annual wine consumption of, 5 billion litres. The drink soon spread to other countries, including Switzerland, Spain, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, and even the United States, where it was especially popular in French-speaking New Orleans and formed the basis of one of the US's oldest cocktail recipes, the Sazerac. By this time, the drink had also acquired its own set of elaborate preparation rituals. Traditionally, a glass of absinthe is served with a sugar cube, a specially slotted spoon, and a carafe of ice water. To prepare the drinker balances the spoon over the mouth of the glass, places the sugar cube on the spoon, and pours the ice water over the cube, diluting the spirit to a drinkable proof and softening its bitter herbal flavor. Eventually, bars and cafes began providing large communal absinthe fountains to dispense ice water, allowing patrons to socialize as they prepared their drinks. The dilution of absinthe causes the drink to turn cloudy, a phenomenon known as louche, or the ouzo effect. This effect is the result of essential oils from the botanical flavorings, especially transanthol from anise, being soluble in alcohol but not water. Diluting the spirit with water causes these compounds to come out of the solution, producing the characteristic cloudiness. Another preparation technique, known as the Bohemian method, involves soaking the sugar cube in high-proof alcohol, lighting it on fire, and tipping it into the glass, imparting the drink with a smoky caramel flavor. While widely performed in specialty bars today, the Bohemian method is not actually a traditional technique, and it dates back only to the 1990s. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the period traditionally known as the Gilded Age or La Belle Epoque, absinthe was widely consumed by all social classes, from the wealthy bourgeoisie to ordinary working class people, and especially artists, writers, and other members of the emerging Bohemian movement. The drink appears in dozens of paintings by leading artists, as well as the writings of several famous authors. Much of absinthe's appeal among the Bohemian set lay in its purported ability to induce a pleasant lucid intoxication, or even full-blown hallucinations, properties which, along with the spirit's distinctive color, led it to acquiring the immortal nickname the Green Fairy. Absinthe's supposed psychoactive properties were vividly described by authors like Oscar Wilde, who wrote, "The first stage is like ordinary drinking. The second stage, when you begin to see monstrous and cruel things, but if you can persevere, you will enter in upon the third stage, where you see things that you want to see, wonderful, curious things." One night I was left sitting, drinking alone and very late in the Café Royal, and I had just got into this third stage when a waiter came in with a green apron and began to pile the chairs on the tables. "Time to go, sir," he called out to me. He then brought in a watering can and began to water the floor. "Time's up, sir. I'm afraid you must go now, sir." "Waiter, are you watering the flowers?" I asked, but he didn't answer. "What are your favourite flowers, waiter?" I asked again. "Now, sir, I must really ask you to go. Time's up," he said firmly. "I'm sure that tulips are your favourite flowers," I said, and as I got up and passed out into the street, I felt the heavy tulip heads brushing against my shins. French poet Baudelaire even ranked the effects of absinthe ahead of wine and opium, writing in his 1857 poem Poison, "None of which equals the poison welling up in your eyes that show me my poor soul reversed, my dreams throng to drink at those green distorting pools." But with the increasing association between absinthe and artists, writers, revolutionaries, and other misfits came the inevitable backlash, and social reformers began blaming the Green Fairy for all manner of social ills. One of the drink's fiercest opponents was Dr. Valentin Magnan, chief psychiatrist at Paris's St. Anne Asylum. Between 1864 and 1874, Magnan conducted a study of 250 cases of alcoholism and concluded that those who abused absinthe suffered more severe symptoms, including rapid onset hallucinations, than those who drank other forms of alcohol. This observation led him to propose a syndrome known as absinthism, whose effects were distinct from those of regular alcoholism. Quote, "In absinthism, the hallucinating delirium is most active, most terrifying, sometimes provoking reactions of an extremely violent and dangerous nature. Another, more grave syndrome accompanies this. All of a sudden, the absinthist cries out, pales, loses consciousness, and falls. The features contract, the jaws clench, the pupils dilate, the eyes roll up, the limbs stiffen, a jet of urine escapes, gas and waste material are brusquely expulsed. In just a few seconds, the face becomes contorted, the limbs twitch, the eyes are strongly convulsed, the jaws gnash, and the tongue, projected between the teeth, is badly gnawed. A bloody saliva covers the lip, the face grows red, becomes purplish, swollen, the eyes are bulging, tearful, the respiration is loud, and then the movements cease. The whole body relaxes, the sphincter releases, the evacuations soil the sick man. Suddenly, he lifts his head and casts his eyes around him with a look of bewilderment. Coming to himself after a while, he doesn't remember one thing that has happened." Thanks to Magnan's research, absinthism became a cause célèbre among reform-minded conservative groups. In France, firebrand Henri Schmidt rallied against the drink, writing, "Absinthe makes you crazy and criminal, provokes epilepsy and tuberculosis, and has killed thousands of French people. It makes a ferocious beast of a man, a martyr of a woman, and a degenerate of the infant. It disorganizes and ruins the family, and menaces the future of the country." The cause was especially popular among members of the growing temperance movement who saw absinthe as an easy target and a stepping stone to the eventual banning of all alcohol. Another supporter was the French wine industry, which had nearly been wiped out in the 1860s by an aphid infestation, and saw the growing absinthe industry as a threat. The anti-absinthe crusade reached its crescendo in 1905 thanks to a particularly grisly murder. On August 28, 1905, Jean Lanfray, a French labourer living in the town of Comugny, Switzerland, shot and killed his pregnant wife and children in a drunken rage. Lanfray, an alcoholic, had consumed that day no less than 7 glasses of wine, 6 glasses of cognac, 2 coffees laced with cognac, 2 crème de menthe, and 2 ounces of absinthe. However, the courts and the popular press focused solely on the absinthe, with psychiatrist Dr. Albert Marheim, an expert witness, called for the defense, arguing that Lanfray had suffered from a classic case of absinthe madness. A moral panic ensued, and a subsequent petition to ban absinthe in Switzerland collected more than 82,000 signatures. A referendum was held on the 5th of July 1908, and the ban on absinthe was written into the Swiss constitution. Bans in other countries soon followed, including Belgium in 1908, the United States in 1912, Italy in 1913. France held out until 1915, when concerns over the potential effects of absinthe on the fighting ability of French soldiers finally compelled the country to ban the drink. These bans forced major absinthe distillers like Pernod Ricard to switch to making pastis, ouzo, and other wormwood-free anise liqueurs. Absinthe production and consumption continued in countries like Spain, where it was still legal, while in Switzerland it went underground, with illegal distillers largely producing colourless white absinthe in an attempt to conceal it from the authorities. However, the drink never regained the popularity it had enjoyed in the late 19th century, and by the 1960s, absinthe had all but disappeared from Europe, becoming little more than a mythical symbol of a bygone romantic age. But was absinthe really a powerful hallucinogen, as both its devotees and detractors claimed? In a word, no. The supposed psychoactive properties of absinthe have traditionally been blamed on one key ingredient: wormwood, or more specifically, a compound known as thujone, naturally found in wormwood oil. This theory was first proposed in 1864 by absinthe's nemesis, Dr. Valentin Magnan, who in a series of experiments exposed guinea pigs to pure wormwood oil and alcohol vapor. While the animals exposed to wormwood vapor experienced violent convulsions, those exposed to alcohol vapor did not. However, more recent studies have cast considerable doubt on Magnan's findings, revealing that while thujone can induce convulsions in high doses, such doses are almost impossible to attain by drinking absinthe. For example, the average dose of thujone that produces convulsion in rats is 12.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. A typical bottle of absinthe, by contrast, contains only about 10 milligrams of thujone per litre, meaning that an average 90-kilogram male would have to consume more than 100 litres of absinthe to reach these levels. And given that absinthe is typically bottled at an alcohol concentration of up to 74%, even the most seasoned drinker would succumb to alcohol poisoning long before the thujone even began to have any effect. Indeed, the only 2 confirmed cases of thujone poisoning, one in 1862 and one in 1997, were caused by the consumption not of absinthe but of pure wormwood oil, which can contain up to 50% thujone. So what then was responsible for absinthe's reportedly toxic side effects? One possible explanation is the practice among less scrupulous absinthe producers of using chemical shortcuts to reduce manufacturing costs, such as using toxic copper compounds to achieve the distinctive green color, or antimony trichloride to replicate the Loesching or ouzo effect. However, the consensus among most historians and medical experts is that absinthe's legendary reputation as the potent, mind-altering green fairy is nothing more than an overblown myth, the product of artistic hyperbole by its devotees and hysterical propaganda by its detractors. Indeed, between the years 1867 and 1912, some 16,500 patients were admitted to Paris asylums suffering from chronic alcoholism, of which only 1% were found to exhibit the symptoms of absinthism. Given the high rates of absinthe consumption in Paris at the time, it's more than likely that the most severe cases of alcoholism were simply ascribed to Dr. Magnan's fictitious syndrome. In the end, absinthe's bad reputation has far more to do with its association with artists, poets, philosophers, and other bohemian misfits than any actual psychoactive properties. In 1988, the near-century-long ban on absinthe was finally lifted when the European Council passed a directive on the approximation of the laws of the member states relating to flavorings for use in foodstuffs and to source materials for their production, which re-allowed the inclusion of wormwood in alcoholic beverages. Since then, absinthe has enjoyed something of a renaissance, with hundreds of distilleries, large and small, capitalizing on absinthe's almost mythical reputation and its association with classic art and literature.
I think we can all agree that snobs are the worst. When it comes to wine, basically every study ever conducted has concluded that it's ridiculously easy to convince even the top sommeliers that $5 boxed white wine is the finest red wine ever bottled. It's also not because wines they would happily sacrifice their firstborn to have a glass of and would otherwise have raved about when told it contains some cheap wine are more than likely to claim that it tastes like horse piss. No, the fact that human psychology is so big a part of the whole wine mythos and how we perceive tastes and smells, that's not actually our big problem here. Humans are gonna human after all, and everybody likes what they like, with human psychology often playing a big role in that, and so really, who are we to judge? No. The real problem is a rather vocal subset of wine connoisseurs who are astoundingly snooty about the whole thing, making all of the rest of us wine lovers look bad in the process. This level of snobbishness is particularly rich given that some of them have spent thousands of hours of their precious time on Earth doing nothing more than becoming an expert on grape juice. You know, the stuff that, without alcohol, your 2-year-old drinks at $3 a gallon. The reality is you might as well go and get highfalutin about your fuzzy sock collection, which, to be fair, is absolutely fabulously comfy, I'm quite sure. Perhaps nothing sums all of this up better than the so-called Judgment of Paris, an event that would change the wine world forever and for the better. Besides the more productive outcomes, the event saw some of the top pearl-clutching French wine snobs throw a near year-long temper tantrum because they accidentally revealed that in a blind taste test that they not only largely misidentified the American wine from the supposedly far superior French wine, but they strongly preferred the American adult grape juice. The origins of the Judgment of Paris, they can be traced to a well-meaning promoter of French wine and an owner of a wine store in Paris called Steven Spurrier. Spurrier organized the event with hopes of highlighting that the quality of wine coming from California at the time wasn't nearly as bad as its reputation then held. He also hoped in the process to drum up some additional business for his Parisian wine shop in highlighting the many French wines that could be purchased there. Naturally, he, along with pretty much everyone else in the world, assumed the French wines would win this contest pretty handily. In organizing the event, Spurrier scouted what he felt were the finest wines currently produced in California and pitted them deathmatch style against their closest French equivalent. To judge the competition, Spurrier tracked down some of France's top wine experts, including the then editor of the French Wine Review, Odette Kahn, as well as several professional sommeliers, the elite of wine tasters, and they were all of the French persuasion. All in all, Spurrier was able to assemble a veritable dream team of wine-sniffing talent consisting of 9 of the best palates in the business. To round out the numbers, Spurrier himself took part, as did American wine connoisseur Patricia Gallagher. Realizing that accusations of bias would inevitably be levied against him if French wines cleaned house at the event, Spurrier opted to make the event a blind tasting and told his fellow judges to simply judge each wine on its own merits, not by any specific scale. This was something that his judges had no problem with at first. Although Spurrier attempted to publicize the competition as widely as he could, sending invites to almost every major media outlet that he could think of, the whole thing was seen as being such a non-story that only a single journalist showed up to cover the event. That was Time magazine's George M. Tabor. Tabor would later state that he only showed up as a favor to Spurrier and, like almost everyone else, assumed the French wines would win hands down, which would likely see his article have about as much interest as one titled "Water is Wet." Tabor, who unlike the judges knew which wines were which ahead of time, quickly changed his mind though when he saw French restaurateur and chef Raymond Oliver say to himself, back to France, while sampling a Napa Valley Chardonnay. As Tabor would later recount in an interview with NPR, I thought, hey, maybe I've got a story here. And oh man, did he have a story. The subsequent piece that he wrote has been called the most significant news story ever written about wine. Why? Well, almost every judge placed at least one American wine above its French counterpart, while several, including a later mortified Kahn, deemed an American wine, both red and white, to be the best overall. In fact, the American wines as a group absolutely dominated 1992 Olympic basketball dream team style. While this might seem like a non-story today, it's important to understand the context here. Again, at this point in history, it was generally assumed by pretty much every wine expert that French wine was vastly superior to all other wines in the world for a variety of reasons, including things like soil, weather, and secret methods passed down through the centuries that were only known to French winemakers. As Tabor would later comment on the results, it turned out to be the most important event because it broke the myth that only in France could you make great wine. It opened the door for this phenomenon today of the globalization of wine. Wine expert and author David White further chimed in, stating, "The 1976 judgment totally changed the game. The results gave winemakers everywhere a reason to believe that they too could take on the greatest wines in the world." Not long after this event, the creation of new wine vineyards across the world absolutely exploded. On top of this, according to the founder of the award-winning wine brand Stag's Leap, Warren Winarski, winemakers also began more openly sharing information about their methods with others in the field. What all this revealed was that the French winemakers had been falling well behind the times in a lot of areas, owing to keeping to various traditions and classical ways of doing things, whereas newer vineyard owners had been more open to embracing improved methods and technologies. Thus, thanks to this event, Winarski states, "The wines of the world are better, the wines of France are better." Alright, let's get back to the judgment of Paris. Upon hearing the results, a furious Odette Khan tried and failed to get her ballot back, reportedly desperate to stop anyone from finding out how she'd ranked the wines, fearing that it would ruin her considerable reputation in the wine world. When her efforts failed, she resorted to slandering Spurrier and claiming that the event, judged near exclusively by French wine experts in France, put on by a guy at the time who only sold and spent his life championing French wine, had been rigged against French wine. Khan and others also saw to it that Spurrier was temporarily ostracized from the French wine community, initially making it difficult for him to stock the shelves of his wine shop, as well as banning him from the prestigious French wine tasting tour for a year. Even after that year, he found himself occasionally having trouble acquiring certain wines, such as finding himself banned from the de Mont-Ramonet-Prud'hon vineyard when he went there to make a purchase over a year later. Not all was lost for Spurrier, however. He would later go on to win a variety of awards in the wine industry, including one for, ironically, his services to French wine. But before all this, the French media responded by effectively burying the story of the judgment of Paris. In fact, among the scant mentions of it in French papers from the time, some questioned whether the event had actually even happened. One that did acknowledge it simply argued that the experiment was merely an example of the silliness that can occur at blind tastings, which, to be fair, well, it's a valid point, though the overarching result of the event still stood. While exact results may vary from test to test, French wines weren't in a class of their own anymore. That said, 30 years later, Spurrier organized yet another blind tasting, very much like the first, to see if the results would change, but again, this resulted in American wines winning top honors. This time, however, seemingly nobody was greatly surprised nor upset. Turns out you can make great wine in a variety of regions in the world, and not just in France.
The world of alcoholic cocktails is dizzyingly diverse, with as many potential drink combinations as there are variety of alcohol and mixes. Some, like the Cuba Libre rum mixed with Coca-Cola, are very simple, while others, like the Commonwealth, a monstrous record-breaking concoction boasting an astounding 71 ingredients sourced from every nation in the British Commonwealth, are more complex. Over the years, countless adventurous mixologists have attempted to put their own twist on these classic recipes, swapping in exotic ingredients and engaging in the strange alchemy of molecular gastronomy in the quest for the ultimate beverage experience. But when it comes to unique mixed drinks, it's hard to beat the sourdough cocktail, the signature speciality of the Sourdough Saloon in Dawson City, Canada. The recipe is simple: 1 ounce of whiskey and dehydrated human toe. To understand how this bizarrely macabre drink came to be, it is important to understand the history and character of Dawson City. Located in Canada's northern Yukon Territory on the confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers, the city was founded in 1897 by Joseph Ledoux and named after famous Canadian geologist George Mercer Dawson. The town came to prominence in 1896 when large gold deposits were discovered in the region, triggering the Klondike Gold Rush. The sudden influx of prospectors hoping to strike it rich turned Dawson City into the ultimate boomtown. By 1898, the once tiny settlement had become a bustling city of 17,000 with dozens of hotels, boarding houses, shops, saloons, music halls, movie theaters, brothels, and other establishments to keep the prospectors supplied and entertained. Entrepreneurs from far and wide descended upon Dawson to make their fortunes, including theatre builder Sid Grauman, vaudeville tycoon Alexander Pantages, and future real estate mogul Fred Trump, grandfather of Donald Trump. The city soon took on a romantic reputation as the Paris of the North, immortalized in works of fiction such as Jack London's The Call of the Wild and White Fang, and Robert Service's The Spell of the Yukon and The Cremation of Sam McGee. But the town's heyday was tragically short-lived, for by 1899 the gold had all dried up and the prospectors moved on to greener pastures in Alaska. By the time Dawson was incorporated as a city in 1902, its population had fallen to barely 5,000. Dawson was dealt a further blow during the Second World War by the construction of the Alaska Highway, which both caused its population to plummet and the territorial capital to be moved from Dawson to Whitehorse. The town limped along, barely clinging to existence until the 1970s, when the rising price of gold and new mechanized placer mining techniques made the Klondike goldfields profitable once more. Increased tourism also brought new life to the city, which today boasts a population of around 1,300, 8 national historic sites, a thriving local economy, and the same eccentric frontier spirit. It was in the 1920s, at the start of Dawson City's wilderness years, that the story of the sourdough cocktail begins. According to legend, brothers Louis and Otto Lincoln, successful bootleggers in the region, were transporting a shipment of rum by dog sled when they became caught in a blizzard. While crossing a frozen river, Louis stepped through some thin ice and soaked his foot. By the time the brothers reached their cabin, Louis's foot was frozen solid. To avoid the onset of gangrene, Otto used an axe to chop off Louis's toe. He then placed the severed digit in a jar of alcohol to preserve it and keep it in the cabin as a souvenir. 5 decades later, in 1973, Dick Stevenson, a bartender at the Sourdough Saloon in Dawson City's downtown hotel, allegedly discovered the preserved toe in a rundown cabin that he'd purchased. A well-known and eccentric local character, Stevenson, known to everyone in town as Captain, brought the toe back to the sourdough and began plunking it into the drinks of adventurous patrons. And just like that, a bizarre local tradition was born. Today, the sourdough cocktail forms part of an elaborate ritual complete with detailed rules. To become a member of the exclusive Sourdough Club, patrons must first order a shot of their choice. Yukon Jack whiskey is the most popular, and then pay $8 to a toe captain, a specially designated server in a sea captain's hat who serves the cocktail and explains the rules. Those being that the patron must touch the mummified toe with their lips without biting, chewing, or putting the toe in their mouth. Or, as the saloon's catchy slogan puts it, you can drink it fast, you can drink it slow, but your lips must touch this gnarly toe. The toe captain then lifts the desiccated toe from the jar of salt used to preserve it, drops it in the glass, and bids the brave patron to drink up. Reviews of the taste have been mixed, to say the least, with 34-year-old Vancouver resident Lindsay Wilson describing the experience in 2018 as traumatizing. The texture of it was really disgusting, but I don't remember a taste. The feel of it was really, really gross. It was like a greasy raisin. Yet despite such glowing reviews, the sourdough cocktail has proven a surprising hit among tourists to the area, as of this recording, over 100,000 people from all around the world have taken the plunge and joined the Sourdough Club, or as the practice of imbibing alcohol laced with human body parts run afoul of the local health authorities, with Adam Girl, general manager of the downtown hotel, explaining in 2019, "We've had the chief medical officer of the Yukon look at it and give it a clean bill of health, as long as we keep the toes mummified, which we do by keeping them on salt and serving it in 40% alcohol. That keeps everything legal." However, in case you're wondering, no, the toe currently in use is not the same toe Captain Dick Stevenson discovered in 1973. That original toe lasted only 7 years before being lost in an unfortunate accident. According to the Sourdough Club website, in July 1980, a miner named Gary Younger was trying for the sourdough record. On his 13th glass of sourdough champagne, his chair tipped over backwards and he swallowed the toe. Sadly, toe number 1 was not recovered. Since that time, 7 more toes have been donated to the saloon to keep the tradition going. The first replacement toe was amputated due to an inoperable corn. The second was a victim of frostbite. The third was donated anonymously. The fourth and fifth were donated by a nursing home resident in exchange for free drinks for his nurses. The sixth was amputated due to diabetes. And the seventh arrived anonymously with a note reading, "Don't wear open-toe sandals while mowing the lawn." But perhaps stranger than the toes' various origins are the number of times they have been deliberately stolen. To discourage the theft of what is understandably a scarce commodity, following the loss of the original toe, the Sourdough Saloon began charging a $500 fine to anyone caught swallowing or stealing the garnish. This apparently did not discourage one unnamed man who, on August 24, 2013, ordered a sourdough shot, swallowed the toe, paid the fine, and left. In June 2017, another toe was stolen from the saloon, but later returned by mail. As a result of these incidents, the fine has since been increased to $2,500. Over the years, the Sourdough Saloon has lost around 15 toes to a combination of theft, accidental swallowing, and regular wear and tear. But new toes are donated all the time, ensuring the continued survival of this bizarre drink tradition. Today, the saloon maintains a rotation of 10 toes, which are cured in salt for 6 months prior to being served and periodically retired. retired as they begin to break down. 3 of these were donated by former British Royal Marine and endurance athlete Nick Griffiths, who lost them to frostbite during the 2018 Yukon Arctic Ultramarathon. But the most recent additions to the Sourdoughs collection came from a truly legendary source, Captain Dick Stevenson himself, who died in October 2019 at the age of 89. In his will, Stevenson requested that all 10 of his toes be pickled and donated to his beloved saloon so that they might tickle the lips of adventurous patrons for years to come. It is a bequest wholly befitting such an eccentric and beloved local character, with Stevenson's daughter Dixie stating, "Dad is a publicity hound, and he just said he was going to be more famous after he's dead." So the next time you find yourself in Dawson City, why not stop by the Sourdough Saloon and earn your place in the vaunted Sourdough Cocktail Hall of Fame. It is likely the most full-bodied drink you'll ever have. Bonus facts. The name of the sourdough cocktail and its namesake saloon is a reference to the moniker sourdough, long used to describe residents of Alaska and the Yukon. This curious nickname originated during the Klondike and Alaska gold rushes, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police forbade prospective gold prospectors from crossing into the Yukon or Alaska without a year's worth of supplies. As these supplies could only be carried over the treacherous mountain passes by sledge or on the prospectors' backs, efficiency was key. While many bread recipes required eggs, milk, and other bulky ingredients, sourdough required only flour and a sourdough starter containing lactic acid bacteria and yeast, and could produce far more food than the equivalent weight in canned goods. Sourdough starter thus became standard equipment for prospectors. There was only one problem. Sourdough starter does not react well in cold temperatures and must be kept warm to remain potent. The Gold Rush era is replete with stories of prospectors building shelves for their sourdough starters above the stove before furnishing the rest of their cabins, or sleeping with the sourdough jar tucked into their clothes to keep it warm through the cold nights. Over the years, sourdough became intimately associated with the Gold Rush and of the men and women who had the tenacity and ingenuity to brave the harsh Alaskan winters year after year and scrape a living out of the rugged northern frontier. In addition to its rich mining heritage, literary legacy, and the sourdough cocktail, Dawson City has yet another claim to fame: one of the world's largest collections of previously lost silent films. In the early 20th century, Dawson City boasted no fewer than 3 movie theaters: the Palace Grand, the Orpheum, and the Family Theater. After touring through more major North American cities, popular films and newsreels would make their way to Dawson, the end of the line for the film distribution network. As they were too expensive to ship back to the studios, these reels simply accumulated in the basement of the town's Carnegie Library, creating something of a storage problem. At the time, movies were projected on nitrocellulose film, which is extremely flammable and has a tendency to spontaneously burst into flames. Wishing to avoid the kind of fires that have destroyed numerous film repositories over the years, the Dawson residents cast about for a safe place to dispose of the reels. The solution came in 1929 when the Amateur Athletics Association became unable to continue running the local swimming pool. The film reels, along with other trash, were thrown into the abandoned pool, covered with dirt, and the site converted into an outdoor skating rink. There, the reels remained buried and forgotten until 1978, when construction workers building a new recreation centre accidentally stumbled upon the cache. The discovery soon came to the attention of Michael Gates, the newly arrived curator for Parks Canada, who immediately recognised the importance of the find. The permafrost at the bottom of the old pool had preserved an astonishing 533 reels of film, including period newsreels and dozens of Hollywood films by such luminaries as D.W. Griffith and Todd Browning, many of which are the only copies known to exist anywhere in the world. In the early days of cinema, films were considered as disposable as newspapers, and little effort was made to preserve them, meaning that over 90% of films made before 1929 are now considered lost. The Dawson City films very nearly joined them, for as the reels were pulled up into the hot August sun, the emulsion immediately began to melt. While the film was eventually stabilized and preserved, the melting emulsion imparted on the footage a distinctive damage known to filmmakers as the Dawson flutter. Due to the volatile and dangerous nature of the nitrate film, the reels were flown out of Dawson by military transport and placed into climate-controlled storage at the Library and Archives Canada and the US Library of Congress. The films were then transferred onto more stable safety film for future study. Thus preserved, the Dawson City find represents an invaluable treasure trove of early cinema and a unique window into everyday life and culture in the early 20th century.
Hello, I'm Dave and Hiskey, and today we've got something a little different for you. We received a question from a Today I Found Out subscriber on whether or not tapping a shaken soda can actually result in less foam spewing out, as is the widely held belief. This seemed interesting enough to us, but when we looked far and wide for a definitive answer, we uncharacteristically came up empty. So we decided to run an experiment ourselves to find out the answer. Alright, now to be clear, when looking at answering the question of whether tapping a shaken can of soda actually does anything, certainly there are many otherwise reputable sources throwing out an opinion on both sides of the argument. But outside of Snopes, nobody seems to have bothered to experimentally have tested whether tapping the can does anything. And as for Snopes, while they technically did do an experiment, this was a reported sample size of just 3 runs, although they do allude to a variety of experiments not reported. Now, it is possible one doesn't need a large sample size here to get meaningful results, so perhaps 3 runs is a perfectly sufficient sample. However, Snopes gives no hard quantitative data, only anecdotal observations on this one, and did not necessarily shake each of the cans the exact same way, though did time it, and presumably the shaking was approximately the same if they had the same person shaking each time. But needless to say, while Snopes' conclusion may end up being perfectly correct, we weren't really comfortable stating it as a definitive answer here given the way the experiment was conducted and the lack of hard data. But if you're curious, their results indicated that tapping the side of the can produced slightly less foam than simply waiting to open it, but otherwise from a practical standpoint didn't really make a difference. As for expert opinions, these also were conflicting, though perhaps the best such source, in Cornell University biochemist and one of the world's leading beverage foam experts, and yes, that is a thing, Carl J. Siebert rang in on the side that at best tapping the can does nothing in his opinion, and even potentially makes the problem worse. As Dr. Siebert states, by tapping the can, you risk creating more bubbles. Despite this, many otherwise reputable sources claim that tapping the can does actually help. Why? As you're probably aware, when you shake the can, the agitation causes some of the dissolved carbon dioxide in the container to form bubbles at various nucleation sites on the inner surface. It's also further widely held that some of the bubbles formed will stick to the inside of the container at these various nucleation sites, rather than rising to the top. When the can is opened and the high pressure thus removed, these bubbles rapidly expand and shoot to the top of the container, pushing out some of the liquid with them. Thus, the hypothesis is that by tapping on the can, you can dislodge these bubbles and cause them to float to the top before opening the container, so that when you do open the can, the gas can expand and escape without taking any liquid with it. Seems reasonable enough, but does this actually work? To begin with, in our little experiment, we needed a device that could shake our soda cans exactly the same every single time. The Shakenator T3000 we made to do this works such that with each button press, it shakes the can exactly 10 times with a stroke length of 1.125 inches or 2.9 centimeters. Through a bit of experimentation, we ultimately found that, at our coldest measured temperature, about 150 shakes at about 8.8 complete shakes per second was around the point where we started getting very good, measurable results with Coke cans, so went with that for the number of shakes. Because temperature is a big factor in how much foam is produced, the device also reports the temperature after each run, along with the number of shakes and the time it took for the run to complete. Now to the experiment. There are a variety of ways we could have done this, but as we're far more interested in the amount of foam coming out rather than the amount of carbon dioxide, we're choosing to measure the liquid that comes out of the can, glass bottle, and plastic bottle when the respective containers are shaken and then tapped on the side, shaken and then tapped on the top, shaken but not tapped, simply waiting for the same time interval as if we tapped it, and then shaken and quickly opened upon removal from the machine. This latter one is particularly of interest as one alternate hypothesis often put forth on why tapping the can does increase your odds of avoiding a fizzy bath has nothing to do with the tapping itself, but is because people tapping the container wait a short interval before opening it, giving some of the carbon dioxide time to redissolve into the liquid and any formed bubbles to rise to the top where they won't push any liquid out. Also, just because we were curious, we ran an additional experiment shaking several cans and then opening them at intervals to see how long it would take for no more liquid to be pushed out. Obviously, the results here will vary for other shaking scenarios based on a variety of factors, but we were really just curious about the broad ballpark numbers on this one. So what were our results? Well, it turns out that the actual tapping of the can does absolutely nothing. However, we were very surprised to note that the seemingly insignificant time interval here of 20 seconds from shaking to open actually did make a huge difference in the amount of foam produced. And in fact, on the runs when we opened the can as fast as possible after being shaken, even just a change of a few seconds appears to have made a big difference in foam output, as you'll see from the results, which show that that portion, which was the only one not precisely timed, is the only place we really saw a large variance in resulting foam, even though every open in that case was within a few seconds of each other. As for the rest of the subtle variance in the other runs, it was interesting to observe how even the tiniest change in the opening speed of the containers, which results in the pressure being released at different rates, made a very measurable difference in the foam produced, to the point where I was eventually able to roughly predict the foam output based on how I judged the opening speed. Despite the fact that in all cases with the can and glass bottles, it only took a fraction of a second to open them completely. Specifically, using video footage of a dozen openings on each, we measured an average of 0.07 seconds to fully open the glass bottles, and 0.22 seconds for the cans. With the plastic bottles, this was likewise very similarly timed each time, though it took on average about 1.91 seconds to fully twist the cap off, with the slightly wider variance there resulting in a bit larger range in output foam. As for tapping in the air versus on a hard surface, it would seem this didn't have a noticeable effect either way, and because it actually takes quite a bit of shaking to get a measurable amount of foam spillage, using a gram as the smallest increment, for reference here the containers in question contain roughly 340 grams of liquid, we're guessing in real-world scenarios where people are trying to reduce foam by tapping, nobody's tapping the can vigorously enough to make a noticeable difference in foam output. It's also noteworthy that whether tapping 30 times or 50 made no real difference here in terms of the expected outcome. Another interesting point is that the plastic bottles produce significantly more foam, despite it taking much longer to fully open them. As previously mentioned, based on our observations with all container types, even a fraction of a second change in opening speed made a noticeable difference in foam output. And given it took roughly 13 times longer to open the plastic container fully compared to the average of the glass and the cans, one might have initially expected that the plastic containers would produce much less foam as a result, not more. Given how much carbon dioxide is added significantly affects the taste of the beverages, we're presuming Coca-Cola does not vary initial carbonation level added based on container type. If that's correct, we're guessing that the plastic containers must contain much greater number of nucleation sites than glass or aluminum, ultimately producing many more bubbles for the same shakes. This brings us to how long we had to wait until no foam was produced. We initially expected we'd have to go out to intervals of maybe even as much as an hour to see the foam completely disappear, but we were woefully incorrect on this point. In fact, our first experimental run of just 60 seconds of waiting ended up producing no foam whatsoever, despite the 150 vigorous shakes and the small geyser produced at a few second interval given those shakes. We then broke it down to 10-second intervals and found that at the colder temperatures, it took just 50 seconds for foaming out of the container to no longer occur, and at 40 seconds, while there was a slight overflow onto the lid area, it was not even a gram's worth, and certainly didn't naturally spill off the container. At the higher room temperature, the results were surprisingly similar at 40 seconds, producing just slightly more foam than at the 40-second mark in the colder temperature, more or less mimicking the 30-second run at the colder temperature. Similarly, the 50 and 60-second marks at room temperature mimic the 40 and 50-second marks respectively at the near refrigeration temperature. As to why there's so little foam being produced after such a short interval, it would seem to us that there are two possibilities, both of which may be coming into play here. The first possibility is that the carbon dioxide is rapidly being redissolved in the liquid, but as we didn't measure the actual escape CO2 compared to an unshaken container, we can't say for certain to what extent that is happening. The second possibility is simply that all the bubbles created from the shaking rise to the top in this time span, and with no further shaking causing more bubbles to form at the nucleation sites, the undissolved carbon dioxide is simply escaping when you open the can without pushing out any liquid. Supporting the idea that this is the bigger factor in this case is footage of the shaken glass and plastic bottles, which show a dramatic drop-off in created bubbles in the relatively short time span after shaking is stopped, with those created all rising to the top relatively quickly quickly and no visible bubbles clinging to the sides, as is often stated happen when people talk about the supposed benefits of tapping the container. Further, while we didn't measure the carbon dioxide output, for what it's worth, observationally, even when no significant foam was produced, there still sounded like a lot more gas escaping when opening these shaken cans compared to opening cans that had just been sitting around, which we did several times just to compare the sound back to back. Though of course, further experimentation measuring the actual carbon dioxide output would need to be done to know for sure. So there you have it, we now know for certain that tapping a can of soda does absolutely nothing to reduce foam, and is actually the short time interval taken to tap the can that is reducing foaming versus simply opening the can immediately. It also very much appears that tapping the container vigorously, which while potentially could have produced more foam via further agitation, did not produce any practical increase in the fizz. And while your results will vary based on things like temperature, atmospheric pressure, and how much a given can was shaken, it would very much appear in all cases you really don't need to wait more than around a minute or so for things to stabilize to the point where you can safely open the soda container without risk of foam over, even if you open the container quickly. Bonus fact. Just for fun, we also ran this experiment on cans of Dr. Pepper to see if the results changed at all. They did not in terms of the main points already made. However, what was interesting to note was that the Dr. Pepper produced about half as much foam on average as the Coca-Cola for each of the scenarios. There are a variety of potential ingredients that can cause a difference here. For instance, with many diet sodas that contain aspartame, they end up producing more foam because aspartame lowers the surface tension of the liquid much more than sugar or corn syrup will. It's possible Coca-Cola simply contains more surfactants than Dr. Pepper. Or it's possible Dr. Pepper just contains much less carbon dioxide than Coca-Cola. Given the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the beverage greatly influences the taste and mouthfeel, we're presuming there is a reasonable variance from flavor to flavor. And anecdotally, it does always seem like Dr. Pepper goes flat much faster than a lot of soft drinks. But that's an experiment for another day. For now, whatever is the underlying cause, we thought it was interesting to note how much less foam an equally shaken can of Dr. Pepper produces compared to a can of Coke.
For many, Sundays mean brunch and a delicious morning cocktail. Quite often, that early alcoholic beverage is the odd combination of tomato juice, celery, hot sauce, Worcestershire sauce, vodka, and other spices that's known as a Bloody Mary. While admittedly it's pretty tasty, the recipe isn't exactly intuitively good. So how was this smorgasbord of a beverage ever concocted? And was it actually named after a 16th century queen who had the habit of burning people at the stake? As the fifth of 6 children of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and the only one to survive infancy, Mary Tudor was preordained as royalty when she was born in 1515. But it wasn't easy for Mary, whose father had desperately wanted a son, which he did eventually have. When Henry VIII annulled his marriage to Catherine and instead wedded Anne Boleyn, Mary was declared illegitimate. Nonetheless, Mary still had a path to the throne, and when her younger half-brother Edward VI died from tuberculosis at 15, it seemed she would become queen. However, due to Mary's illegitimacy and fear she would convert the country back to Roman Catholicism, a plot was put in place to install Henry VIII's niece, Lady Jane Grey, instead. After only 9 days, public support for Mary was too strong, and Grey was usurped. Queen Mary finally took her place upon the throne. Mary's brief 5-year reign as queen was violent and harsh. She turned the country back to Roman Catholicism and began an active campaign of persecution of Protestants. Those who didn't follow her strict heresy laws risked being burned at the stake. All in all, approximately 300 Protestants were killed during Mary Tudor's reign, earning her the long-remembered nickname Bloody Mary. While the monarch stuck, she was not unique among monarchs of the era in terms of executing people at will. In fact, Henry VIII executed not hundreds but many thousands during his reign, but nobody nicknamed him Bloody Henry. In the end, however, Bloody Mary's methods of forcing her nation to Catholicism were not effective, and as so often happens, the victors colored the events and people of history to their liking. After her death in 1558, from what some historians believe to have been prolactinoma along with ovarian cancer, the country returned to being Protestant. Flash forward a few centuries to the invention of the drink that may or may not bear her nickname. Now, we have two commonly accepted origin stories of the Bloody Mary drink, both of which have entered the annals of history as the story behind the invention of the elixir, depending on what otherwise reputable source you want to consult. While both stories have plenty of holes in them, there is enough documented evidence to get a fair, though not perfect, idea of the genesis of the drink. The first tale begins in an American bar in Paris. Opened on Thanksgiving Day in 1911 by an expat and horse jockey named Ted Sloan, the New York bar became a hotspot for American soldiers during World War I. In 1923, Sloan sold the bar to Scotsman Harry McElhone, who was once a bartender at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. After purchasing it, Harry added his name to the bar, making it Harry's New York Bar. The establishment is still there today. Along with notable American guests like Rita Hayworth, Ernest Hemingway, and Humphrey Bogart, a lot of Russian emigres who had escaped the Russian Revolution also patronized the bar. One of Harry's bartenders at the time was Fernand Petiot, who had risen up from kitchen boy at 16 to bartender. Realizing it was profitable to make cocktails with Russian vodka due to the new clientele, Petiot began experimenting with the hard liquid. Eventually, he found a match with canned tomato juice cocktail. The customers loved the new drink, Russians, Americans, and French, and voila, a popular drink was born. According to this version of things, Americans brought the Bloody Mary back stateside, and soon Petiot was offered a plum job being the main bartender at the King Cole Bar at the St. Regis Hotel in New York. He made the move in 1934 and remained one of the city's most famed barkeeps until his retirement in 1966. So what about the name Bloody Mary? One legend has it that Petiot simply named it after Queen Bloody Mary Tudor as a dark joke in war-ravaged Europe. Another says the name was a suggestion from a frequent customer, American entertainer Roy Barton, in homage to his favorite waitress, Mary, at the Chicago nightclub Bucket of Blood. The club's name purportedly stems from the dirty, bloody mop water that employees would throw in the streets after cleaning up after the violent nightly activities that happened at their establishment. Whether that's how the notorious nightclub really got its name or not, Petiot did state in an interview in January of 1972 with the Cleveland Press that it was indeed a customer who suggested the name Bloody Mary after the aforementioned waitress at the Bucket of Blood. However, there is no direct evidence backing up this assertion, mostly just a lot of vague recollections from events that happened many decades before. Human memory being what it is, and particularly factoring in our brain's amazing ability to inject even very detailed false memories for a surprising amount of our recollections, it's not clear whether this is really how the name came to be. We'll get into this in a bit. What we do know for sure is that when Petiot started serving his drink in New York, at least as far as documented evidence reveals, he wasn't calling it the Bloody Mary. Instead, he had dubbed it the Red Snapper. One can still get a Red Snapper at the King Cole Bar today. However, he did initially call it the Bloody Mary, but shortly after his arrival, the owner of the bar requested the name be changed, but there is no direct evidence to support this supposition. The first known documented instance of it being called Bloody Mary didn't occur until 1939 in an article written in the Chicago Tribune, written by Walter Winchell. This was several years after Petiot came to the United States. On top of that, as noted by esteemed etymologist Barry Popick, later in the decade, Petiot claimed he invented the Bloody Mary drink and gave it that name in Paris. Harry's New York bar, where he worked, published a recipe book of its drinks, but there is no mention of anything resembling a Bloody Mary, let alone any drink using the name. Popick also notes skepticism in Petiot's recollections, owing to the fact that commercial canned tomato juice wasn't a thing until the late 1920s, after Petiot claims he used a canned tomato juice cocktail as an ingredient in the drink. It is possible Petiot's recollection is mostly correct, with him simply getting his dates wrong. This would also perhaps explain the absence of the drink in the 1920s Harry's recipe book. That said, the earliest surviving recipe of the drink under the name Bloody Mary didn't come about until Lucius Beebe's Stork Club bar book, published in 1946. This particular reference was also not crediting Petiot with inventing the drink, nor using his recipe. This brings us to the next widely cited origin story. In this tale of how the Bloody Mary was invented, its creator was the Toastmaster General of the United States, George Jessel. A famed vaudeville star, Broadway actor, comedian, and master of ceremonies of his day, he claims to have invented the drink in 1927. He stated in his 1975 autobiography, The the world I lived in. In 1927, I was living in Palm Beach, or on a short visit, I don't remember which, where nearly every year I captained a softball team for a game against the elite of Palm Beach, such as the Woolworth Donahues, the Al Vanderbilts, the Reeves, and their ilk. Following the game, myself and a guy named Elliot Spurver, a Philadelphia playboy, went to LeMais's and started swilling champagne. We were still going strong at 8 a.m. the next morning. We tried everything to kill our hangovers and sober up. Then Charlie, the bartender, enjoying our plight, reached behind the bar. "Here, George, try this," he said, holding up a dusty bottle I had never seen before. "They call it vodka. We've had it for 6 years and nobody has ever asked for it." I looked at it, sniffed it, it was pretty pungent and smelled like rotten potatoes. Hell, what have we got to lose? Get some Worcestershire sauce, some tomato juice and lemon, that ought to kill the smell, I commanded Charlie. I also remembered that Constance Talmadge, destined to be my future sister-in-law, always used to drink something with tomatoes in it to clear her head the next morning, and it always worked, at least for her. "We've tried everything else, boys. We may as well try this," I said as I started mixing the ingredients in a large glass. After we had taken a few quaffs, we all started to feel a little better. The mixture seemed to knock out the butterflies. Just at that moment, Mary Brown Warburton walked in. A member of the Philadelphia branch of the Wanamaker department store family, she liked to be around show business people and later had a fling with Ted Healy, the comic. She had obviously been out all night because she was still dressed in a beautiful white evening dress. "Here, Mary, take a taste of this and see what you think." Just as she did, she spilled some down the front of her white evening gown, took one look at the mess and laughed. "Now you can call me Bloody Mary, George." From that day to this, the concoction I put together at LeMais's has remained a Bloody Mary with very few variations. Charlie pushed it every morning when the gang was under the weather. Now, about a year later, the benefit of Joe E. Lewis was to be held at the Oriental Theatre, and I was sitting in my hotel room with Ted Healy before leaving for the theatre. Ted, as usual, was slightly inebriated. He happened to pick up a copy of a Chicago paper and read an item in Winchell's column. It said I had named the Bloody Mary after Ted's then steady girl, Mary Brown Warburton. Ted turned white. "What the hell are you doing, making a pass at my girl, you son of a bitch?" he yelled. And just as he did, he pulled out a pistol and tried to shoot me. I ducked and the shot missed, but as the pistol went within a foot of my right ear, I was completely deaf for a week. I had a hell of a job doing the benefit that night. So, which story is true? It would seem parts of both, with a pinch of misremembering mixed in, along with some ambiguity with regards to how close a recipe needs to be before you can call it a Bloody Mary today. You see, before either of these gentlemen claimed to have invented the Bloody Mary, and before they definitely both helped popularize it, there were countless recipes for exceptionally similar drinks, sans alcohol. For instance, in the March 12, 1892 edition of the Hospital Gazette in London, it mentions a beverage served in a club across the pond in Manhattan that was made as follows. For the benefit of those who may be possessed by suicidal intentions, I give the recipe. 7 small oysters are dropped into a tumbler, to which must be added a pinch of salt, 3 drops of fiery Tabasco sauce, 3 drops of Mexican chili sauce, and a spoonful of lemon juice. To this mixture, add a little horseradish and green pepper sauce, African pepper ketchup, black pepper, and fill up with tomato juice. There were also other similar recipes in the ensuing few decades before Jessel and Petiot added alcohol, subtracted the oysters, and added other things like Worcestershire sauce. So it seems questionable that either of their recollections of how inspiration struck them to conjure up the otherwise rather odd concoction was perfectly accurate. In fact, in a 1955 Smirnoff vodka ad campaign, 58-year-old Jessel wasn't nearly as certain he'd invented the Bloody Mary as 76-year-old Jessel was while writing his autobiography. In that 1955 ad campaign, he stated, "I think I invented the Bloody Mary, Red Snapper, Tomato Pickup, or Morning Glory." He then goes on to describe in much less detail the events of creating the beverage, though in this case insinuating that he really just wanted to drink some good Smirnoff vodka, but felt he needed the nutrients of tomato juice, so slapped them together, the juice for the body and the vodka for the spirit, and if I wasn't the first ever, I was the happiest ever. Given the prevalence of similar known recipes of the age minus the vodka, it is probably more likely that these two gentlemen were familiar with the basic cocktail and simply tweaked it slightly to their own liking and added alcohol, with the fact that they helped popularize it being why they are given the credit today. So who came up with their version first and who actually named it Bloody Mary? It's worth noting that Walter Inchell, the author of the aforementioned Chicago Tribune article, which is the first documented reference of the drink being called Bloody Mary, was a friend of Jessel's. He stated in this first Bloody Mary reference that the drink was vodka with tomato juice. A few months later, in December of 1939, the aforementioned Lucius Beebe, whose 1946 recipe of the drink is the oldest known surviving named Bloody Mary recipe today, wrote in the New York Herald, "George Jessel's newest pick-me-up, which is receiving attention from the town's paragraphers, is called a Bloody Mary. Half tomato juice, half vodka." Of course, the rub comes from when you want to start calling a drink with a certain set of ingredients a Bloody Mary, at least as far as we think of it today. In a 1964 interview with The New Yorker, Petiot himself elaborated on this, noting, "I initiated the Bloody Mary of today. Jessel said he created it, but it was really nothing but vodka and tomato juice when I took it over." And indeed, the first known recipes for the drink seem to mostly back up Petiot's claim. In the 1946 Stork Club bar book, Jessel's recipe for the Bloody Mary was listed as 3 ounces of vodka, 2 ounces of tomato juice, 2 dashes of Angostura bitters, and juice of half a lemon. However, a half-decade earlier, in Crosby Gage's Cocktail Guide and Lady's Companion, we have the first known documented instance of the recipe for Petiot's Red Snapper, which was sent to Crosby directly from an individual at Petiot's place of work. 2 ounces tomato juice, 2 ounces vodka, half a teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, 1 pinch of salt, 1 pinch of cayenne pepper, 1 dash of lemon juice, salt, pepper, and red pepper to taste. So, if you want to start calling a Bloody Mary, if it has the minimum base ingredients of vodka and tomato juice, the credit would mostly lie with Jessel, as he claimed. But Petiot's drink is closer to the general Bloody Mary recipe that we know and love today. It was just under a different name. In either case, it would seem rather than a revolutionary new drink, both of these Bloody Mary recipes were more of an evolution of other very similar drinks being made at the time, with the primary contribution here being getting the ratios to each individual's liking and then adding vodka and helping to popularize the mixtures. As to the name, the leading candidates are Petiot's 1972 recollection of a customer suggesting it be called Bloody Mary after a waitress at Chicago's Bucket of Blood, and Jessel's 1975 recollection of naming it after Mary Brown Warburton, daughter of department store magnate John Wanamaker. Petiot's claim has zero hard evidence to back it up, and there is also no documented evidence that he ever called it a Bloody Mary at any establishment he worked at, and that the 1920s recipe book from the bar he claims to have invented it at did not mention the drink. That would seem to be a strike against his recollection. On the other hand, in the earliest known instances of the drink being called a Bloody Mary, Jessel is given credit for the drink, but technically not explicitly for the name, though in some instances it seems implied. So we're left in the very tenuous position of relying on either person's 1970s recollection of how they came up with the Bloody Mary name way back in the 1920s. Keeping in mind caveats concerning the extreme fallibility of human memory after even short periods, let alone decades, Jessel technically has the stronger claim given he at least has some contemporary evidence on his side with regards to the first documented instances of the name of the drink being used. So the slight edge, perhaps, goes to the drink being named after heiress Mary Warburton. Whatever the case, no contemporary evidence points in any way to the 16th century Queen Mary being the inspiration for the name. That's a supposition that didn't come about until decades later. A similar, popular, incorrect assertion put forth by certain otherwise extremely reputable sources, nobody bats 1,000, is that the name was inspired by a character in the 1958 film South Pacific. This idea seems to have popped up owing to the fact that it was in the mid to late 50s that the drink's popularity really began to explode thanks to the 1950s Smirnoff ads featuring Jessel. But of course, the name of the drink predates this film and the ad campaign by a good margin.
So in the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Sawmill Turtle asks us, would you be willing to look into the origins of one for me and one for my homies while pouring some drink on the ground?
To most people, the idea of pouring one out in regards to the act of pouring a small amount of some manner of alcoholic beverage onto the ground in remembrance of one's dead homies is a pop culture phenomenon. But it turns out the practice's origins can basically be traced back as far as recorded history. Noted as being one of the oldest known human customs, pouring one out, or libations as it's more accurately known, is a ritualistic practice that humans have been doing for at least 5,000 years. Virtually indistinct from its modern equivalent, the earliest known group to do this, the ancient Egyptians, generally didn't pour out alcohol in reverence of their fallen kin and friends, but instead commonly poured out water. This is thought to be because it had rejuvenating power and it was associated with giving life. That said, ancient Egyptians were known on occasion to pour out other liquids in memory of the dead, including things like milk, honey, and occasionally wine and other spirits. Whatever they were tipping, the general practice was to pour out a bit of the drink, imbibe the rest, and break the containers that the drink was in on the ground, leaving the remains behind. As an example, pouring one out is specifically noted in the Papyrus of Ani, dating to around the 13th century BC, where it notes, "Pour libation for your father and mother who rest in the valley of the dead. Do not forget to do this even when you are away from home, for as you do for your parents, your children will do for you also." The same is true of other cultures across ancient Africa who, in addition to pouring libations in memory of others, did so to thank the gods and/or ward off vengeful spirits as the situation required. Moving on to the ancient Greeks, they similarly offered libations to both the gods and fallen comrades, usually in the form of sweetened wine, which they'd pour a little of out before drinking in appreciation of whomever they were honoring. The act of the Greeks pouring one out even gets its name dropped in the Iliad, specifically in Book 6, where the mother of the legendary warrior Hector tells him, "Wait till I fetch you some sweet honeyed wine, first to pour a libation to Zeus and the other gods, and then for your relief, if you will drink." Moving on from the Greeks, the Jews also got in on the action. For example, just as an offering is recorded among other places in Genesis 35:14, where it states, "Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, God, even a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it." And in fact, it would seem that virtually every other culture has engaged in this practice throughout history, which, judging by our research, is virtually all of them ranging from the ancient Chinese to the indigenous people of South America. And they all did this for the same reasons, in homage to various gods or to the deceased. Although some cultures certainly took this practice more seriously than others, our personal favorite being the ancient Romans, who created stone chalices built into their tombs that mourners could pour wine into, as well as drop various food items into. These chalices would even sometimes contain a sophisticated draining system, with these libation tubes funneling the alcohol or other item directly onto the corpse. Yep, in this case, mourners could quite literally pour one out onto the skeleton of the person being honored, which is probably the most metal thing we've ever talked about here. According to one Dr. Tracy Prowse of McMaster University, one didn't even need to be wealthy to have a libation tube. It is commonly found in graves of people from all stations. She also states, the main point was to maintain an ongoing relationship with the dead, so their family would sit and have a meal at the gravesite and share that meal with the deceased. Romans believed that they had to keep the spirits of their ancestors content, otherwise they might become vengeful. Offering proper rituals and libations was a way to keep them happy. In the Western world, this type of practice did see a sharp drop-off with the rise of Christianity, though still endured across much of the rest of the world, including throughout Africa, where it is still an extremely popular tradition even to this day. On that note, exactly how humans went from dumping gallons of wine onto the skeletons of their ancestors to ritualistically pouring one out onto the sidewalk while looking as threatening as possible in a music video, it's not definitively known. However, given that this was more or less introduced to pop culture thanks to a variety of African-American hip-hop artists, and pouring one out has been mildly prevalent in African-American culture, particularly in the southern states, for centuries, it seems likely that this wasn't something that some rapper or producer came up with independently while planning out a video shoot. It's far more likely they were already familiar with the custom, at least in some form, and decided to incorporate it into their act. This trope particularly saw a huge surge in popularity in the 1990s thanks to the likes of Boyz II Men and Tupac Shakur, with the latter directly referencing the act in several of his songs, most notably Pour Out a Little Liquor, which was released in 1994. In fact, Tupac was so linked to this practice that one of the first things people did upon hearing that he'd been killed was ceremoniously pour liquor onto the street corner where he was shot, something that apparently still occurs on occasion to this very day. But to sum up, nobody is really quite sure who first got the idea of pouring one out for your homies, as it's seemingly been something humans have done for as long as we've been humans. But given our propensity to give food offerings to deities and ancestors seemingly throughout history, it's not exactly a surprise that we also thought offering said entities a drink would be a good idea. Or, as Dr. James Earlier, director of the Smithsonian Institution's Center for Folk Life Programs and Cultural Studies, notes, there is something very basic about pouring blessings into the earth. That is where you are buried. It figures into all worldviews and religions. We initially emerged as a people living very close to the earth, and the earth provided everything we needed. We poured libations to acknowledge that our love and insights do not come solely from us, but from those who came before us. Musicians have been paying homage to the practice of pouring one out going back a lot further than modern rap. For example, an Irish musical ballad dated to the mid-19th century called Finnegan's Wake talks about an old alcoholic called, funnily enough, Finnegan, who passes away and is then revived by some spilling of whiskey on his coffin. A nod to the fact that in Gaelic, whiskey translates quite literally to water of life. Not an isolated instance, the idea of libations is a common theme in Irish folk music even today, with bands such as the Dropkick Murphys making reference to it in songs like Jimmy Collins's Wake, which contains the lyric, "We've gathered here to bid adieu us Boston boys. Alas our few, some from crosstown, some from the coast, to give our skipper one last toast. We'll pour the good stuff round his casket."
An early example of beneficial government regulation to proof alcohol was simply to test and verify that the contents of a barrel of liquid was what it claimed to be. The process began in England around the 16th century. Its original purpose was not consumer protection, but rather to ensure that the state, read the king, collected the proper amount of taxes on the sale of the product. Alcohol, called proof spirits, was taxed at a higher rate. The first method was imprecise at best and involved soaking a gun pellet in the liquid and then trying to light it on fire. If it burned, it was classified as a proof spirit. However, as alcohol's flammability is dependent on its temperature, the higher the temperature, the more vapors the alcohol-infused solution will emit, and therefore the more flammable, sometimes actual alcohol was passed off as something less and taxed at a lower rate. Nonetheless, frequently the product would catch fire, and by that the authorities would know that the spirit, usually rum, was at least 57.15% alcohol by volume, ABV, which at that time was classified as being 100 proof. As scientific skills improved, by the early 19th century, a far more accurate test was developed which measured the liquid's specific gravity, the ratio of the density of a substance to a reference, in this case distilled water. Distilled water is actually denser than alcohol. Accordingly, in 1816, a test was developed that relied on the fact that at 11 degrees Celsius, that's 51 degrees Fahrenheit, a 100 proof spirit, about 57.15% ABV, would weigh 12/13 that of distilled water. As 57.15% is roughly equivalent to 4 in 7, in the UK, in order to convert a lower alcohol to proof, you simply multiply the ABV by 7/4 or 1.75. So, if you had a delicious IPA with an ABV of 16.9%, in the UK this would be 12.075 degrees of proof, while a 100% ABV pure alcohol would have a proof of 175 degrees. In the US, this somewhat complicated method was rejected. In an early example of too long didn't read, and instead proof is calculated simply by doubling the ABV. So in the States, that IPA would be 13.8 proof, while Jack Daniels with an ABV of 40% is 80 proof. Of course, some spirits far exceeded these ABVs, with a number of neutral grain and rectified spirits reaching ABVs of 96%, 168 degrees of proof in the UK and 192 degrees of proof in the US. In the United States, these alcohols are regulated, if at all, by the particular states. For example, Nevada prohibits the sale of alcohol in excess of 80% ABV, and California prohibits the sale of anything over 60% ABV. Uncle Sam has singled out one alcohol in particular for regulation, however, absinthe. Sometimes called the Green Fairy, this exotic spirit with an ABV of 45 to 75%, infused with green anise, fennel, and other herbs, and most notably grand woodworm, fueled Paris's Belle Epoque, and is credited by some as inspiring a variety of artistic movements, such as Surrealism, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Modernism, and Cubism, as well as the writings of notables including Oscar Wilde and Ernest Hemingway. In the early 1900s, a number of countries banned absinthe. 1912 in the US, due in equal measure to a smear campaign conducted by the wine industry, lurid tales of men under its spell committing horrid violent crimes, and the presumed presence of thujone, a chemical compound that is said to be poisonous in large amounts. As it turns out though, absinthe actually has very small amounts of thujone and easily meets all regulatory requirements in the US, which is no more than 10 parts per million. As such, as of about 2007, absinthe returned to the US, both as imports from Europe along with domestic producers springing up as well.
John asks us, has anyone ever really filled a pool with alcohol? Wow, we really are answering the questions that everyone needs to know. How much does that cost? Let's do it. Several hotels around the world catering to the uber-wealthy offer a bizarrely specific package that offers customers the chance to float around in a hot tub filled with champagne. As pleasant as it sounds to soak your nether regions in warm bubbly, you'd think someone somewhere would have taken the concept to its logical conclusion by filling a pool with their liquor of choice and swimming around in it. As it turns out, however, this would not only be impossibly expensive, but extremely dangerous too. First, though, as alluded to, while there are several examples we could find of people filling things like hot tubs with champagne, such as one hotel in London offering this for a mere $50,000, what a steal! Every story we found discussing someone filling a pool with alcohol ended up being wildly exaggerated. For example, in 2010, a story broke about a hedonistic orgy of debauchery organized in the home of a British lord called Edward Davenport sometime in 2009 that involved a swimming pool filled with alcohol that partygoers could row across. Now, that sentence probably conjured up an image of people wearing immaculate suits and eyes wide shut masks gliding across a pristine lake of shimmering alcohol, perhaps laughing about how rich they are while occasionally dipping champagne flutes into the water. No one wants to drink, you'd be in that hot tub and it's like, nah, I'm not gonna drink that. It's touched my balls. In reality, however, the whole thing was a PR stunt by the brand Courvoisier, and the pool only contained about 1,000 litres, that's 264 gallons of liquid. That's still a lot. That's a lot of booze, it is, but we're guessing most people who read that sentence imagine a proper-sized swimming pool filled with alcohol, not one of those oversized kiddie pools you can buy for about $50, because, yes, along with the pool not even being big enough for a proper adult to lie down in, tickets for the event were on sale for about £6.50 or $11. Not exactly the hedonistic night of excess attended only by the ultra-wealthy promised by the headlines, which, as ever, are generally more interested in clicks than even feigning to attempt accuracy. The same can be said concerning the headlines you may have seen about the Starkenberger beer pools. Located in Turenz, Austria, beer aficionados can tour a castle said to contain the only pools in the world filled entirely with beer. Again, the truth is a little less impressive than that, and while the pools are big enough to swim around in, being about 13 feet wide, they're really more akin to oversized hot tubs than anything else, although they do come the closest we could find to an actual pool full of booze, ringing in at about 21,000 litres, that's 5,500 gallons of beer. That said, it should be noted that it's an extremely watered-down version of the beverage. Also, it's not a great idea to attempt to drink the beer, beyond random people submersing their bodies in it. Exactly. It's apparently a bit of a thing for some to use the pools for their purported medicinal value in treating open wounds and psoriasis. Lovely. Like touching my balls and my flesh wounds. Combined with the whole warm and watered down thing, it's probably best to bring your own drink. And I have to say, little personal anecdote, I have done this, and there is one where there is just a beer tap next to your like hot tub full of it's not really beer, it's just like watered down with a little bit of beer in it.
but you do have a beer you can pour from, which is awesome. Alright, but let's get to the question, shall we? Because we're already several minutes in. Smash that dislike button. So, how much would it actually cost to fill an actual proper sized swimming pool entirely with genuine undiluted alcoholic beverages rather than half-arsing it like mere plebeians? Well, quite a lot. For starters, you'd need about 2.5 million litres, or about 660,000 gallons of your tipple of choice if you wanted to fill a standard Olympic-sized pool. Sure, we could use the dimensions of a smaller pool for our math, but if you're going to throw an opulent party, best to go big or go home. And really, if it's a reasonable sized swimming pool, it's gonna be super expensive and dangerous anyway. So how much does it cost? Well, this depends on what you like to drink. Starting with beer, you can buy a standard keg of beer containing about 15.5 gallons of the nectar of the gods for about $175 to $200. So you'd need about 42,000 kegs to fill the pool, enough to satisfy Olympic guidelines. This would cost about $7,456,468, rounding to the nearest dollar. Now, you'd probably receive some sort of discount for buying the equivalent of 5 million pints of beer at once, so you could probably shave a fair amount off that estimate. That said, as George Clooney discovered when he attempted to buy custom-made tequila in bulk, when buying huge volumes of alcohol like that, he was told you need an appropriate alcohol buying business license to do so. Fun fact, in his case, this resulted in he and a couple of friends deciding to start a tequila company, which they then sold a few years later for about $1 billion. As for sort of discounts you could get, for whatever it's worth here, according to one brewer we looked at, they noted approximately 25% of the cost of beer goes into actually producing the product, with the rest in profit margins, taxes, shipping, retail margins, etc., etc. So, we guess in this case, if you made it yourself and also thus avoided all of the taxes associated with selling alcohol, you might get the cost down to a couple of million, or alternatively, you might be able to get a bulk discount from a mass producer to maybe go down to 4 or 5 million at best. Moving on to the harder stuff, a standard bottle of wine contains 750 milliliters of liquid, so you'd need 3,333,333 bottles and a third of another to fill the pool to the top. Depending on how much you like, it's desperately specific, don't forget that third of a bottle. You could drink the 2/3 that remains as a reward. Depending on how much you like to spend on wine, the cost of filling the pool would vary dramatically. For example, you could potentially fill the pool entirely with Charles Shaw wine, colloquially known as $2 Chuck in California, because it sells for $1.99. And you could fill the pool for $6,633,333. $2 Chuck is infamously cheaper than bottled water in some stores, so you'd actually be less opulent filling a pool with this thing than Evian or something like that. But if you're stuck on wine, in this case, we're guessing there wouldn't be much of a bulk discount, as it's already pretty close to the margins, which is why it gets progressively more expensive the further you get away from the maker. As a quick aside here, beyond this discount wine having won several awards despite its ultra-cheap nature, contrary to popular belief, it is not sold cheaply to get back at the creator's ex-wife or any similar internet rumors. In fact, Charles Shaw himself wasn't even involved in setting the price, as the label was acquired by another company, Bronco Wine Co., after Shaw declared bankruptcy in the 1990s. Beyond the Bronco Wine Company already dealing in inexpensive wines, the real genesis of $2 Chuck was simply a massive surplus of wine in late 2001 and 2002, which caused the company to sell off the surplus at even more rock-bottom prices than their norm. It was that or just dump it into the ground. Sales skyrocketed to the point where it still made sense to keep the price there, and, well, so they did, selling on the order of 800 million bottles of the stuff over the next decade alone. As CEO Fred Franzia notes, when people wonder how he makes a profit selling something cheaper than bottled water of the same size, they're overcharging for the water. Don't you get it? We choose to sell good quality wines at $2 a bottle because we think it's a fair price. We think the other people are charging too much. Okay, going back to filling pools with the swill. Now, if you have more refined taste and wanted to fill the pool with a wine that allows you to put your nose higher in the air when you discuss it, even buying lower mid-level wine still raises the potential cost to well over $20 million at best. The same can be said of barrels of various spirits like whiskey and tequila. Using Jack Daniels as a baseline, a company that famously lets customers simply buy an entire barrel of its product because they're just that nice, as are their lawyers, as we've discussed before,
before, a barrel containing roughly 210 to 240 liters of booze will set you back about $12,000 to $13,500. There's no fixed price for a barrel because some alcohol will naturally evaporate during the distilling process, something colloquially referred to by the company as the angel's share. Funnily enough, from this, buying a barrel ends up costing more on average, resulting in you paying about $50 per bottle. However, it would be easier to empty a couple thousand barrels into a pool than a few million bottles, so probably worth paying for the extra convenience. Okay, so how much would all of this cost in total? Well, it's difficult to get an exact figure because of the aforementioned evaporation, but our ballpark estimate is that it would cost $133,333,333 based on needing 11,111 barrels containing an average of 225 liters of whiskey, each being sold for $12,000 a piece. Again, in this case, we're assuming you get a hefty discount for buying in bulk though, but even if you could cut that in half, you're still looking at a sum beyond the realm of possibility for all but the richest of the rich. So finally we get to champagne. Since the numbers are already getting silly, let's go all out and work out what it would cost to fill your pool with a high quality, well-reviewed champagne like Veuve Clicquot, a magnum of which you can buy for about $150 if you shop around. Once again, plopping this into our little swimming pool equation, you'd need 1,666,666 bottles to fill the pool almost to the top, then most of another bottle to fill it to the brim. This would cost, by our estimate, about $250 million if you got the champagne for the aforementioned price of $150 a bottle. Of course, at that price, you might be able to just buy a producer of the stuff yourself and ramp up production as needed for your pool-filling dreams, and thus, in the end, get the actual amount at cost and without many of the associated taxes. You could then turn around and sell the company after the party to get your money back. Although, given the volume used there for you instead of filling shelves, you'd probably see a lot of your previous contracts cancelled, and thus the value of your company may or may not be what it was before. But the publicity would be amazing. But either way, even if you manage to get it for the bargain basement price of the $100 million or so that you have lying around in your couch cushions, you certainly wouldn't want to swim in it. As you may or may not be aware, alcohol is less dense than water, making it incredibly difficult for you to stay buoyant in, so swimming in a spirit like bourbon or vodka would not exactly be easy. But maybe you're a strong swimmer and you don't care about that. Well, the real problem is the fumes from the alcohol, which in all likelihood would very rapidly get you dangerously drunk. And the thing is, unlike say when drinking normally, where various mechanisms, including in the extreme passing out or vomiting, keep you from drinking yourself to death in most cases, when breathing alcohol, there is no such stop mechanism here other than getting away from the pool to clearer air. Further, that alcohol is going right into your blood rather than needing some processing time in your gut. The result is you can extremely rapidly reach alcohol poisoning levels that will kill you dead. And of course, let's just say that passing out while in a pool isn't exactly a great recipe for living, even when it's filled with water. For further details on why inhaling alcohol vapor is a really bad idea versus drinking it, go see our article on our website, The Good and Bad of Vaporizing and Inhaling Alcohol. But for now, as a real-world example here, we have the case of the Silver Sage Winery in Canada, proving immersing yourself in wine, for example, is a bad idea. In this case, a worker named Victor Manola actually fell into a 2,300-litre, 600-gallon tank of still-fermenting wine in 2002. The owner of the winery, Frank Supernack, reached in to help pull him out, but himself slipped and fell in. Tragically, both were overcome and died before they could get out. On top of that, it's noted that even people treading water in the little watered-down beer pools of Starkenberger Castle have occasionally reported getting a little drunk off nothing more than the fumes they breathe in. But to sum up, any stories you have heard about the uber-rich having debauched parties with alcohol-filled swimming pools are most assuredly myths or wild exaggerations. In the end, even with massive bulk discounts, the price tag associated even for the cheapest of alcohols is incredibly high. And more to the point, just standing near the pool for any length of time could get you dangerously drunk, let alone swimming in it. And let's just say we hope no one hanging around the pool is a smoker, because lighting up near it, well, you're not gonna have a good time.
For a lot of people, a nice glass of wine is used to enhance enjoyment of things like the 4 F's that make life worth living. Friends, family, food, and I think there's one other thing there that is escaping me. Regardless of when or where you're drinking that wine, it's almost guaranteed that you'll be drinking it out of a style of container so associated with wine that it literally is colloquially known as a wine glass. To drink such grape juice out of anything else would likely see even non-drinkers slowly distancing themselves from you for fear of your particular brand of crazy. In fact, beyond it being a societal must to imbibe grape juice from such a glass, the most knowledgeable of wine connoisseurs generally insist that for maximal enjoyment, wines must further be matched with specific types of wine glass. But does that actually make a difference? And how did the modern wine glass come to be anyway? To begin with, wine predates humans making glass by at least a few thousand years, and probably much more, with the earliest archaeological evidence of winemaking dating back to around 9,000 years ago. In comparison, humans didn't start making glass more complicated than beads until around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Containers of choice for the earliest of wine drinkers are thought to be things like bamboo, shells, gourds, animal horns, skins, etc. Moving on to the earliest known references to wine glasses, these were various opaque glass containers used in religious ceremonies and beyond, such as one known as the Roman patella cup, so named in modern times for its resemblance to the human kneecap. With advancements in glassmaking, particularly relatively transparent glass around 800 BC and then mold blowing around 50 AD in Rome, glass cups slowly began to become more and more popular among those who could afford them. The most affluent also went beyond glass to even sometimes jewel-encrusted gold and silver goblets for their wine containers of choice. As for the riff-raff, for most of more modern history, they used things like containers made of clay, wood, or leather for their imbibing. Fast forward to the 15th century, and things started to get a little more interesting thanks to Cristallo glass, though only the exceptionally wealthy could afford it. Beyond its rarity, the value of Cristallo glass was largely tied to how clear this glass is, combined with its light refractive qualities, which were particularly enhanced when viewed via the flickering flames of candles and lanterns. Moving swiftly on, in 1873, one George Ravenscroft figured out how to achieve the same basic effect using flint and later sand and lead oxide. While not the first to do this, he was one of the first to industrialize it, as well as ultimately popularize this method. He began doing this in Britain, and it spread to the rest of the world. Once his patent expired just 15 years later, this leaded glass began finding its way into the chandeliers and glassware of the slightly less obscenely wealthy, thanks to being made from more commonly available materials than Cristallo glass and how much easier leaded glass is to work with. It was also around this point that the stem on the wine glass began being elongated significantly, more akin to what was seen on metal goblets of the age, particularly those used in religious ceremonies. It is speculated that this change to glassware was, much like in religious ceremonies and with particular bejeweled cups before, to better display the main part of the vessel, in this case, in all its prismatic glory. Beyond surviving glassware, as an example of the shorter stems more common before this, we have the 1660 painting The Wine Glass by Johannes Vermeer. If you look closely at this painting, you'll also note, in this and other examples from the era, that the inward rim of wine glasses of today was not a thing back then. In fact, this would not become popular until around the mid-20th century for reasons that we'll get into shortly. Another thing worth mentioning in the evolution of the wine glass is that starting around the 19th century and accelerating rapidly in the late 20th century, the size of a typical wine glass has progressively been getting bigger and bigger, while simultaneously the glass itself has gotten thinner and thinner. Now, if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that over the course of the bulk of the evolution of the wine glass to something very similar to what we have today, seemingly at no point was enhancement of the flavor of the wine a consideration in the design elements. It was all about aesthetics. However, this changed in the 20th century. As the century progressed, the idea that the wine glass itself was integral to the perceived flavor of the wine started gaining steam popularly, though not without its detractors. For example, the creator of the famed Good Food Guide and author of the 1951 Plain Man's Guide to Wine, noted gourmet Raymond Postgate, outlines the then common 5 different wine glass types, followed by stating that despite growing popularity of the notion, not one of them improves the wine in any way at all. He further states that, in his opinion, in some cases, certain of these glasses were just used by unscrupulous restaurant owners to make it appear as if you were getting more drink than you actually were. It wouldn't be until about 2 decades after Postgate wrote those words that the wine drinking world would be seemingly forever changed thanks to Bohemian glassmaker Klaus Riedel of the aptly named Riedel Crystal Company. Fighting in the German army during World War II, Rydell was ultimately captured and made a POW. While being transferred back to his home country after the war, he decided to quite literally jump from the train that he was on as it was traveling through Austria. About a decade later, and he and his father decided in 1955 to restart the family glassmaking business, one that had previously been operated by 9 generations of his ancestors, going all the way back to 1756. Almost 2 decades later, seeking a way to bolster sales, Rydell struck upon a rather ingenious idea: create a new line of glassware with each design meant to be suited to different types of wines. This would not only bolster sales from potentially many designs being sold per customer, but also would see his company, at least at first, being the only one who made these supposedly wine-enhancing designs. Using the tongue taste map for partial inspiration for many of his designs, as well as enlisting the aid of various sommeliers, he began introducing his new glasses in the early 1970s. These various shapes were meant to affect both the aroma and how the liquid was ultimately funneled onto the tongue, with the promise being that if you matched the wine to the wine glass, you'd get the best possible flavor out of a given type of wine. And people bought it, literally, with sales of his designs skyrocketing and soon in demand all throughout Europe. And by the 1970s and 1980s, they'd also spread throughout the United States. Of course, the whole tongue taste map idea isn't actually a thing at all, which should be abundantly clear to anyone who has ever tasted pretty much anything ever. As noted taste and smell expert Dr. Linda Bartoshuk of Yale aptly stated in 2004 with regards to Rydell's work, "Your brain doesn't care where taste is coming from in your mouth, and researchers have known this for 30 years." Nevertheless, in the decades since Rydell's work, the idea that different wine glasses actually affect flavor has become an almost universally supported notion by sommeliers, with various pairings suggested by Rydell likewise being popular. So firmly entrenched is this notion that there is even an international standard for wine glasses used for taste testing to make sure that everyone is drinking out of the same types of glasses, both in design and composition, for a given test. But is there any actual evidence to support this idea? Well, if we're talking scientifically rigorous studies, well, no, not really. But it turns out, beyond the word of the people who dedicate their lives to wine, there is some reason to think drinking wine out of a wine glass does make a difference in flavor. So why is that? To begin with, as demonstrated in a 2015 study in Japan, a sniffer camera for imaging of ethanol vaporization from wine, the effect of wine glass shape, different wine glass shapes and temperatures do indeed show different vapor patterns and vapor densities for their contents around the surface of the glass where you sip from. As smell plays a large role in how we perceive something tastes, particularly in something like wine, which is relatively aromatic, and the different vapor patterns will mildly affect the smell, it seems a pretty reasonable hypothesis that the flavor will be affected subtly from this. That said, just because something might subtly change the flavor of something doesn't mean a given person will notice it in a given setting, let alone whether the person will think that change is a good thing given their particular palate. On a similar note, while the tongue taste zone thing is a myth, the flow rate and how much of the tongue is covered by the wine on initial contact will also subtly affect the overall perceived flavor, as can be attested by anyone who has ever drunk anything. It is abundantly clear that guzzling something versus sipping something does make it taste different. But again, your mileage may vary, you might think it's a good change or a bad change, or you might not notice it at all. Next up, the temperature of the wine makes an even bigger difference in flavor, in part for vaporistic reasons. Thus, it's often claimed that drinking wine from a stemmed wine glass rather than a more versatile cup is beneficial, as it keeps your grubby, warm fingers further away from the wine. However, color us extremely skeptical that this one is going to make much of a noticeable difference in many scenarios people drink wine in, despite it often cited as one of the top reasons wine must be drunk in wine glasses. We're hypothesizing that it's only consistently listed as one of the top reasons in reality because it's the most notable difference between wine glasses and many other types of glasses. For example, if you're sipping wine on a beach in Florida in the summer, odds are pretty strong where you're holding the glass isn't going to make one iota of notable difference. Further, while temperature does affect the evaporation rates and thus the aroma, if you're just briefly picking up your glass and then setting it back down after taking a sip, the ambient temperature, whether hot, cold, or somewhere in between, is once again going to strongly dominate. Hold the wine by the bowl for extended periods, however, and it will affect the temperature somewhat, but whether you'll notice or not depends on a number of outside factors, to the point that we're guessing even the greatest of sommeliers aren't going to be able to tell much of a difference difference in a huge number of real-world scenarios. Thus, we're going to need some scientifically rigorous studies before we buy that the majority of the population would notice a difference between holding the bowl versus holding the stem in the vast majority of scenarios. So this brings us to the real largest reason drinking wine in wine glasses probably enhances most people's enjoyment of consuming wine. It turns out how our minds perceive flavor isn't just about taste buds and smells, but rather the environment we're currently in and our preconceived notions, to the point that study after study has shown that with the right suggestion, it's not difficult to convince people they are drinking or eating something completely different than what they are actually eating in blind taste tests. Or for more subtle effects, for example, studies have shown that if someone is drinking whiskey in a room with a lot of wood decor, or in the extreme somewhere like a log cabin, people will rate said whiskey as having a woody flavor. Take those same people and place them outside on a sunny day with the exact same whiskey, and they'll use completely different adjectives to describe the flavor. It's even been found out that changing just the lighting or color of the container holding the thing to be consumed will change people's perception of the taste. In yet another study looking into this fascinating, relatively new field, subjects were given a strawberry dessert on 2 plates, one pink and one black. When the pink dessert was consumed from the pink plate, it was rated as tasting markedly sweeter than the same exact dessert placed on the black plate. Researchers in this field are even starting to narrow down types of music that change our perception of taste. For the curious, while large sample size studies still need to be conducted, the research so far indicates that high-pitched piano or flute music is associated with an increase in sweetness of the flavor of something, while heavy bass is associated with an increase in bitterness. Naturally, certain companies like Starbucks, Nestle, and many other major restaurant chains have in recent years been throwing money at neurogastronomists to try and find music playlists and container types that make their wares taste better to people while also creating an otherwise suitable ambience for a particular establishment. As perception psychologist, which is totally a real job title by the way, Johannes Lecoutre at Nestle states, we are beginning to learn about these things. We don't know necessarily what will come out at that end, but clearly contextual perception is a big opportunity. Thus, much like our historic forebears, it's generally thought aesthetics of the glasses themselves is affecting our perception of taste, in this case, seemingly universally, in a positive way. Thus, despite a lack of any direct studies into the matter, all of this combined has resulted in most wine connoisseurs equating drinking wine out of anything but a suitable wine glass akin to quote the author of How to Drink, Victoria Moore, like buying a state-of-the-art sound system and fitting it to cheap speakers. That said, there still exist certain levels of holdouts among the wine experts of the world. For example, Hugh Johnson and Jancis Robinson from the Oxford Companion to Wine state that while more refined palates can tell a difference in flavor when using different glasses, in their opinion, most people can't. Backing up that it doesn't make enough of a difference to be bothered with is how various major restaurant chains have chosen to deal with the matter. For example, a restaurant manager of the Four Seasons in Hampshire, Andrea Bravi, states, "It was once common practice in Four-Season hotel restaurants to serve each wine in a different shaped vessel. Today, we find that a Bordeaux glass is a great style for most complex red structures, and a Montrachet Chardonnay for whites." So to conclude, while there is no hard scientific proof that drinking wine out of some form of wine glass actually makes a significant difference in flavor, there is enough ancillary evidence to support the hypothesis that there may be something to this. However, assuming this is true, it's not actually clear that a given individual will notice the change, and even if they do, if they'll think the flavor change is a good thing or a bad thing in any given instance. Everybody, of course, has their own unique palate. Like with so many things with wine, while there are a whole lot of experts who will insist that this or that is the best way to enjoy a given wine, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll agree or even notice a difference at all. You like what you like, and if you want to drink Chateau Cheval Blanc 1943 out of a coffee mug that says world's #1 old fart because that's the way you enjoy it best, well, you should. And hey, if your thing is to have a specialized glass made from the finest crystal for each and every different type of wine that you drink because it enhances your enjoyment, well, more power to you. In either case, nobody has the right to make you feel lesser for enjoying the little things in life just the way you like them.